and welcome to the ninth episode of Synthesized Sunsets. We are here with Rashida Smith, who is the program director of Clarion West and also an author of Romantasy novels. So, Rashida, you write fantasy under the pen name Jasmine Silvera. Can you talk a little bit how you developed this brand and also how you got into romance in general?
Oh, so I've always been the fantasy writer who winds up with a lot of kissing, and I just got tired of my writing group telling me to just write a romance, and I went ahead and did it and never looked back. And I'm having a lot of fun writing that. That said, Rashida Smith is not a very evocative branding name for a romance writer. So Jasmine's actually my middle name, and I just put together a name that sounded a little bit more like the vibe I was going for the book. And Silvera is a family name, so I just went down the family tree and found a good pin name.
So when you're Jasmine Silvera on the internet, do you try to act differently or be more mysterious or anything like that?
I've tried that. I think what I love about my brand of fantasy romance is that there is a level of cheek and humor in it, no matter how dark or anything else it gets. So I think I am the same me as Jasmine Silvera me for sure.
What would you say is your favorite book that you've written as Jasmine Silvera?
Oh, um, I mean, I think my favorite is probably my first, just because it was the first one I felt like I was really doing what I wanted to do and writing what I wanted to write. But I think it's not my best one. I mean, so I think there's two different conversations. There was the woohoo, I'm gonna go do what I want to do, and nobody's gonna tell me I can't have bloody murders and also kissing in the same book. But I think it's my craft has grown a lot, and so I would say my best book, which is probably the fourth one. I think that was the one that captured both what I like to do and is the best written. Don't tell the other ones. My heart favorite and my mind favorite.
Yeah, let's talk about what some of these books actually are. Your first trilogy is a romantasy trilogy called Grace Blood, and it also involves, I believe it involves, murder as well as necromancy and also with romance. So can you talk a little bit how that came together and also if there was sort of anything that you weren't getting from romance that you ended up being able to put in your novel?
Okay, so that last one is probably the easiest question, so I'll start there. And that is that I love a lot of world building. I love really dense, complicated world building with politics and social difficulties and all kinds of, and that I felt I wanted more of that. And I saw a little bit of, I think Nalini Singh does some of that really well. So it's definitely like I'm not the only person, but that's what I knew I wanted to do. I was have really kind of deep world building. I think the harder question is I was living in Prague and I wasn't able to work. I was there with my partner, and I was on a resident visa. So I wasn't working and I had all this time and I would just go take tours and walk around the city. And anybody who's been to Prague, it's a really weird, fun city. It's got a lot of interesting history. There's an alchemist area of town that used to be connected under to the castle, and there's a lot of history of occult arts, and I think it's just a really really ripe place for inspiration. Being I was there and I was getting kind of inspired, and I was like, you know what, NaNoWriMo's coming up, and I do NaNoWriMo every year, and I had met another writer. We decided to do it together, and I had two ideas, and I was like, one's this really kind of fun, weird necromancers, and the idea with necromancers was that like alchemy was really cool. I was really into alchemy for a little while, and so I thought necromancy was like kind of closely related to that. And then as I was thinking about it as being a romance and a fantasy romance, I was like, well, what supernatural love interest has yet to have I not seen? I've seen angels, I've seen werewolves, we've seen demons, we've seen, it's like necromancers. Like, could I turn somebody whose whole thing is reanimating the dead into a sex symbol? So let's do it. Challenge accepted. So I had this idea and I was like, I could do this really fun weird Prague thing, or I could do this really serious novel that I've been trying to work on for years and got nowhere. And my writing partner said, you just do the fun one. It's like 50,000 words. If nothing happens, you can toss it, put it in a drawer, and forget about it. And 6 books later, I'm still, I just sort of finished up, I think, what's going to happen for me in books in Prague. And then from there, one idea goes to the other. So, okay, so if he's a necromancer, then what's her deal and what's her story? And I kind of dislike the underpowered, frail human woman that is often on the other side of the equation in some of these books. So I wanted her really to be kind of an expert in what she did. She didn't have to have supernatural powers, although she does sort of, but she did have to be powerful in her own right. And so it became kind of an adversaries to lovers, which is one of my favorite tropes to write. They have to work together. They don't really like each other. They certainly don't trust each other. He doesn't think he needs her. She doesn't want anything to do with him. And one thing leads to another. A little murder, a little mayhem, little car chases through the city. I think that is the least succinct synopsis I've ever given for those books, basically.
Yeah, maybe we want to read it.
The last article that I wrote for the magazine was about how science fiction and a little bit how fantasy kind of spun off as genre fiction by kind of being originally cut from the same cloth. But I'm imagining that you're probably tapped into even more of those conversations because it's not only there's fantasy, but there's also romance. But I don't really know as much about the relationship between romance and literary fiction, especially because romance is like a much more central ingredient as a concept to literature than fantasy. You could imagine an entire literary scene that is all realistic, but to imagine a literary scene without any mention of romance at all seems very strange. So I'm wondering, how bright do you think the line is between romance and then just literary fiction with a big romantic subplot? Do you think it is actually they are pretty far apart, or like maybe not as much?
Yeah, so this is a genre convention. So romance as a genre, as what we think of modern romance, so anything from probably the late 70s on, one of the fundamental components is, and granted, there's no rule book, there's no grand arbiter of romance, but the genre convention is that the storyline focuses on the emotional connection between the characters in a romantic context. And so I'm trying to be very vague because that's, that can be any configuration of beings or number of beings, especially these days. And then also that the story end happily, as a happy ever after is kind of the famous term, or in modern, we call it happy for now, which is just that whatever has happened through the book, the couple, you see them wrap into the sunset together. It may not end in picket fences and babies, but it's definitely some cohesive unit. And that's kind of, if you talk to a reader of romance, that's what they're looking for. They're expecting those two things. And so if you don't give that to them, it's like if people die in the end, it's not a romance. It is it's a story with a strong romantic storyline, or it has a romantic subplot, or it has romance elements, but you don't want to call a romance novel anything that doesn't end in doesn't involve those two components. It's kind of similar to a mystery novel. If they don't solve the mystery at the end, you're going to get a lot of pissed off readers. You will have readers throwing books at walls if you kill off somebody at the end and try to call it a romance novel. So it is distinct, and it is a genre that has its own conventions, like mystery, like sci-fi and fantasy. Although, I think we can say sci-fi fantasy is pretty broad. You can so many subgenres and like subdivisions in that. But I still think we have to respect it in the same way, romance in the same way we do other genres, and kind of honor that those are the conventions that readers are coming for. And literary, I think, is kind of wide open, right? Because it can kind of end anyway. And I've heard, a writer, I wish I could remember her name, talked about literary is its own genre, it has its own tropes. It has its own sense of how a story is told and ways it can end, and focusing on perhaps the prose more and the mood more, or things that are less plot driven, right? Whereas to overgeneralize, I think a lot of genre fiction, things mystery, sci-fi, fantasy, horror, romance, are all pretty like the plot is a pretty heavy element, right? So yeah, so there are some distinctions. And I think especially for modern readers and modern romance readers, particularly who are very, very self-aware and are very into the metadata of a book. And so I mean by that I mean like the tropes or the themes or the various setups. You as a writer want to respect that, because it's no fun to walk into a book thinking you're going to get, knowing that you came here for happiness and it ends in somebody dying tragically. That is not generally how you earn readers in romance. There's a certain agreement, I think, that the author makes with the readers in genre fiction. And we do things when we use tropes and when we use kind of common setups or subgenres. And we have to keep those promises.
Yeah, I was actually just going to ask about that. What would you say are some ways that romance authors, and maybe you personally, subvert the tropes of romance without letting down the audience and not giving them what they expect?
Oh man, I teach a whole class on tropes and ways to work with them because I think a lot of times we use that expression, oh, something is too tropey, or oh, we know all the tropes. And I'm really careful about that because I think for a lot of readers, some readers really enjoy their tropes and they enjoy knowing. I think of horror and horror writers, right? You can just think of how many people or fans and readers go in and they're like, I love a good slasher movie. I love a good cabin in the woods. And they know exactly what they want, right? And that is kind of the sacred trust of, I know I want a group of people who go into the woods and they get stuck in this cabin and then some creepy shows up and then and it's this whole sequence of things. We trusting the writers, the readers are trusting us to kind of deliver on the promise that we're making in a premise, right? That said, the fun part about being a writer is finding out ways to walk that line where you get to surprise people with something that is a turn or not quite what they're expecting. And there's simple, I mean, there's kind of the obvious ways to do it, to do the opposite of the thing. But I think there are more nuanced ways to do it as well. And some of that can be just putting characters that we don't usually see in those particular roles in that trope. So some of it is giving people what they want, and some of them is giving it what they don't know they want until they get it. And that's something that you have to take the chance on a little bit because you can definitely let people down. And authors and books often don't have like a test audience, like a test screening at a movie, where you may take it there and have people like, boo, Loki can't die. And then they save him for 4 more movies, right? You've got to kind of trust, and you have your beta readers and your editor and your agent, perhaps, and people on the way who can help with that. The other reason I'm really careful about not judging, particularly what people love, is because you don't know how much of it they've seen and who's new to something, who has never seen a magical school, kids that get taken away to magic wizard school, and they think it's the coolest thing ever. And for somebody who's been reading fantasy since they were a kid, I've seen that 800 times, and I am so over magic schools. That does nothing for me anymore. So every reader is a little different. And so it's always this to the writers, it's like, write what you love, read as much as you can, keep refilling your well so you're telling the most original version of your story that you can. But you're always going to be pulling from the things that you've seen and you've loved and you appreciate. We can't help that. That's just what we do.
Okay, so let's switch topics. So you are the program director of Clarion West, but you also were a student at Clarion West in 2005.
I've been involved with Clarion West in one way or another for the last 20 years as of next year.
Yeah, so I was looking at the roster for that class, and it was pretty stacked. You were classmates with Kat Rambo, and also Anne Leckie, who've gone on to great success, and then also Octavia Butler was one of the instructors. So I was just wondering, like, what was the vibe? How was the experience of being in class with these people?
Oh man, I don't know. My classmates are going to come after me if I give away too many of the secrets. Like, we've got blood packs that are enforced here. I might melt right off my chair. No, I mean, at the time we were all just kind of starting out in our various. I mean, some people had more experience and had been published and been writing for longer. So it was, I mean, That's why I sort of tell every class that I get a chance to meet is you just know who's going to do what and really get to know each other, because you're going to wind up, who knows, 5 or 10 years down the road where everybody will be. And I think, specifically Kat and Anne are two of the nicest people I've ever met. Just the most, just overwhelmingly kind, very generous with their time and their talent people. One of them are paying me to say this. And I think is the other lesson for people I say is don't let people's bluster convince you that they are worth paying any attention to, because sometimes the quietest people in the room are the ones that do the biggest, most interesting things. So it's a good lesson in just being kind of wonderful to everyone you meet whenever possible. But yeah, I mean, it was a good group. I applied specifically because Octavia was teaching. I probably wouldn't have applied that year. I certainly wasn't. The other instructors were amazing, and hindsight, I was, how did you not? Andy Duncan, like all these amazing writers. But we were the last class that Octavia actually taught before she passed away. So we have, I mean, that I think is kind of one of our anchor points as a group. But what's been really interesting is to see how everyone has gone on to do such different things in their writing career. I mean, like, E.C. Myers is publishing for young sci-fi fantasy fans. We've got Anne, Kat, Rachel Swirsky. It was a really solid group, but I think they're all really solid groups in different ways, and you just never know when and who and what's going to be a kind of breakout thing. But yeah, I mean, I think that's all I can say without the hounds being released on me after the podcast.
Have you participated in many other writing workshops that were not Clarion West?
No. So actually, Clarion West was my first experience with a big writing workshop. I was a journalism major in college. I wanted to go on. I knew I was going to write. I didn't think I was going to be doing speculative fiction or fiction writing per se. I wasn't interested in an MFA or teaching writing. So it was mostly just find a career that is kind of tangentially related to writing enough that I can do it and then have time to do my own work on the side. So all of my education was mostly in nonfiction writing, and my stories were just something I did on the side. I did a lot. I mean, I was kind of constantly writing. So I had a couple of kind of intro to fiction classes in college. And then I took a feminist science fiction class, and the teacher there was the one who turned me on to Clarion West and was like, hey, have you heard of this writing workshop? We had to do a couple of assignments for her class. And she's like, I think you would probably get a lot out of this. And I had no idea what I was getting into, and I had no idea what Clarion West was all about. And was this kind of, once I got in, and I was, oh, I'm in magic school. This is not just me kind of going to this cool writing workshop thing on the weekend. I think I just got into something incredible. And yeah, and so it was my first experience though, and it was a really hard one to have as a first fiction writing experience. It was tough.
Mm-hmm. If you were trying to, I guess, make a pitch to someone who's trying to decide if they want to go to Clarion West versus some other writing workshop, what do you think you would say to them? What do you think makes Clarion West special?
Oh, that's such a great question. I think what I would say is if you have the time and the mental and the resource to go away from your home for 6 weeks and live with 18 other writers and do this thing, you will not regret it if you get in. That said, I would also say it's not the only way to do the thing. So if for some reason none of that configuration works for you in any way, that shouldn't stop you from still finding other roads to the success that you want with your writing. I think Clarion West is great if you're at a particular point where you're really ready to focus and you have the time and energy to do it. I just think that we also need to acknowledge that not everything is for everybody, and that is not a criticism of the thing or the bodies, but there are lots of ways, and there's so many great workshops. If you're really into speculative fiction, if you really want to do Crash Course, if you are really into the building a cohort and being part of a group of writers, I think Clarion West is amazing for you. That said, there's Odyssey, there's Clarion in San Diego. Taos is done, but there's their MFA program. So really evaluate for yourself whether this structure is the kind of structure that will work for your process and the way you write and where you're at. Sometimes you don't know until you get there, and you should always apply. Never self-select out is the other thing I want people to know, is that you just don't. I had no idea I was going to get in. I certainly didn't think that I had anything super distinct about my voice or my writing. I just thought I really loved doing this, and I think I told an interesting story. I basically wrote Octavia Butler fanfic is how I got in. My submission story was like, I just want to write Octavia Butler fanfic, and I got in, and I had this amazing experience. I'm self-select out of it, but also don't overweight it in terms of what you need. If you need something different, if you need to not be at a critique table for 4 hours every day for 6 weeks for any reason, that's okay too. You can still become an amazing writer, published award-winning writer without that experience. So I guess I would just say, make sure you're there for what's good for you and your writing process, and don't try to do it just because you think you have to.
Would you say that you came out of Clarion West with a pretty good sense of your own voice? How would you say that your understanding of your own voice has evolved over your career?
For myself personally, back in 2005, when I was a baby writer who probably wasn't mentally ready for Clarion West, just in terms of like a confidence level and a kind of assuredness in my own voice, I struggled a lot after the workshop. I was one of those students who didn't write for a couple of years afterward. It's kind of this famously apocryphal story. Some of us just come out and don't write for a while. But writing was something that I had loved before Clarion, and it was a thing that I'd always done. And it just took a while for me to internalize the lessons that I had learned and learn to filter my voice, or filter them through what I wanted to do as a writer and the stories that I wanted to tell. And you have this wonderful effect of having 17 other voices plus an instructor, 18 voices in your head for 6 weeks, kind of giving feedback and thinking about work and thinking about writing. And that's wonderful. But you have to have a strong sense of yourself and your own writing. And I think if you don't, you can struggle with that. And I did. But that said, I haven't stopped. And I am grateful for that now, because I have a much tougher skin. I have a much more I'm more convinced about myself and what I'm doing. I give less fucks about some certain things when it comes to telling the stories. And that's a result of Clarion West. So yes, so that's all good things. And I think the great thing that we're doing now is really trying to get writers to that point without having to have been scorched at a critique table first to get there, and realizing that there's so much out of control, out of the hands of the writer in the publishing industry, between the gatekeepers, the agents, and the editors, marketing, promotions, the way the industry works. The best thing that we can do, I think, as a workshop is really support writers and support the goals of the writers with their work, and support helping them develop their voices and helping them to be their first and best ally and advocate by kind of knowing and supporting what they're trying to do, because you just don't have control over what the agents and the editors in New York and publishers want. All you have control over is the story that you're trying to tell.
Do you ever see traces of your own writing in the writings of your classmates or colleagues?
Oh gosh. No, we were all so different. I think this is the other really amazing thing about Clarion West, is that you've got 18 people and you stick them in a house together or in a virtual environment now. And invariably there starts to be a little bleed over of ideas. We had 1 week where I think 2 or 3 people submitted. This was back in the day. We used to be they used to house the students in a sorority house near the University of Washington, which are generally empty, were at the time empty in the summer. And so, but there would be other sororities or fraternities that would rent out their rooms. So they'd be full of college kids on summer vacation. And you can imagine what that scenario is like, red cups and all. And then we were this little group of writers, and so there were a couple of instances where we had some culture clashes with our neighbors, who had all kinds of fun things that they thought we were up to. We got a lot of teasing about being, I think, the Harry Potter school or something. It was like something ridiculous. It was very like, the teasing was it was a little high schooly. But as a result, we had 1 week where I think 3 or 4 stories came in with either the frat boys met an untimely end, or they were like sucked into a black hole, or there was like definitely you could see it in the zeitgeist of the class. We were all processing this experience. And I wish I could remember who one of us published that story, and I wish I could remember off the top of my head. It might have been Heather. Anyway, so yeah, so invariably there are things like that that happen, or everybody turns in a ghost story one week. We're all writing separately, so how did this happen? But the amazing thing is that they're all different stories. Like this is the voice component that is that ineffable thing about writing, is that you can give people the same prompt and you'll get whole group of different stories. So I haven't ever seen anything of mine in anybody else's. And I think that's because nobody can write what I write in the way that I write it. And I can't write an Ann Leckie book, certainly. I mean, I love Anne's work. I can't write, I'm not a Cat Rambo for sure either. And I think both of them do amazing work. It's just we're all very different voices.
Where do you usually go to get your short science fiction or fantasy fix?
Oh, so for many years, I was the editor of Giganotosaurus, which is a webzine that publishes a long story, so like a novella or a novelette length, so a long short story. So if I have the time, I will go there because I still think that they're one of the most underrated publishing sources for like really good longer length speculative fiction. And I think the other thing I learned at Clarion West is I am not naturally a short fiction writer. It is very hard for me to tell a story in 10,000 words even. It's much easier for me to tell it in 80,000, so I just stick to those. But yeah, so I love Giganotosaurus. I think that is still one of those venues that doesn't get nearly as much love, and it's published some really incredible authors and writing. Because for a while they were really the only one in the game publishing long short spec fic. So there, but if I don't have a lot of time, which is often the case, just given everything going on in life right now, I tend to go to like daily science fiction and just get a like quick hit of some flash, flashland. I appreciate well written flash because it feels impossible for me. If short fiction is hard, flash feels like a place I'll never get to. So sometimes I just go there for just a little jolt of some flash.
So you published a story of your own in Giganotosaurus, which was Small Strange Towns.
I did
Um,
not publish that story and publish that story before I was the editor. But yes, yeah, that was actually my first publication, spec fic publication. I'm trying to think. Wait a minute. Yeah, everything else I published for that had been like essays and nonfiction mostly. And that was my week one Clarion West story.
oh wow.
Really?
Okay.
Yeah. So that's where it's actually the only thing I've written at Clarion West that I actually published. Everything else is in a trunk somewhere.
So can you talk a little bit about the story?
Oh yeah. So I used to do these long drives between Sacramento and Arcata, California. There are all these little towns that you pass by signs on the road that you look off the road and there's a turnoff and you can't even see the town. Sure, I guess there's something out there that's named Capet or whatever. And I was one of my what if stories on that long drive of what if there's a little town out there. And that little small towns are strange places. They're kind of unique environments. And then a part of that story actually came to me in a dream. So this is this is where the hippie woo woo comes out. And that was the bit about the town rearranging itself. So the premise is a guy comes back to a town that he grew up in and doesn't remember, and the town rearranges itself. And I won't, for reasons that he discovers as it goes. And that was just a story that I wrote. That was my first week Clarion West story. That was a story I wrote for Octavia Butler after she declined to give me feedback on the Octavia Butler fanfic story that I used to get into the workshop. I think it's pretty obvious that that's what I was doing. She just said, she just said, I think you can do better. I think you've got something else in you that's more you. And so 10,000 words later, kind of crying into my laptop at 4 a.m, out came this. And I think like all my stories, it's from the compost heap of the back of my brain of things that I've encountered and what ifs and weird wonderings and bits of dreams all sort of shoved into a story. And then Anne liked it and she published it. And then she stopped editing Giganotosaurus because I think at that time the ancillary was coming out and she was focusing more on her own fiction. And so shortly after that, she asked if I would be interested in taking over Giganotosaurus. We got a Hugo nomination. And then I left to really kind of focus more on Clarion West stuff and my own writing. Yeah.
Yeah, so for Small Strange Towns, I just read it a couple of days ago. I thought it was very good. And I really felt a lot of love just for the small town energy. And yeah, I was wondering, did you grow up in a small town, or was that just something that just came to you from kind of your imaginations based on driving by these towns?
Oh, I that's definitely been a romanticization of something that may not be as wonderful as a city girl thinks it is. I grew up in Sacramento, which is not a big city as cities go, but it's still very much a city. It was a little bit. I lived in Arcata, California for. I went to finish undergrad there, and then lived there for several years. And it's the kind of town that is very big when school's in session, and then when school is out, the population loves. It's like and it had a very small town feeling. And the longer I lived there, and the more I got to know people who had lived there for their whole lives, it just seemed like a very different place to grow up where you know people or you've known people your whole life and you kind of run into them in all kinds of places and there's all these old stories and grudges and things that you just have to sort of live with. I find it's a little similar to my brief experiences of island culture, where you just it's this little delineated space and everybody has to just make do with each other. And so that was really fascinating to me, that kind of in a city you can kind of change your driving route and never have to see a person or a street or a place again. And you kind of can't do that in a small town. So I think I was really wanting to play with that a little bit. But that story's so old. I mean, I love it still. I still love it, but it feels real old to me now.
Mhm. Yeah, another thing I thought was interesting about it was I'm a big fan of magical realism, and I thought that the magic in the story, I feel like a lot of times in fantasy, there's sort of a need for any non-physics type thing that happens to be the magical system to be perfectly explained and whatnot. And I think there's a place for that, and I'm a big fan of magic systems and whatnot, and like magic schools learning things. But I do feel like that takes a bit of the magic out of it to some extent to have everything explained. And yeah, in this story, right, the magic by which the town rearranges itself there's never an explanation for it, and there doesn't need to be, right? And yeah, I was wondering, like, do you feel like sometimes I feel like in fantasy there's often missing a bit of that. There feels like too much of a need for an explanation. Yeah, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, different strokes for different folks. I think different readers appreciate things, different writers like doing different things. I in a short story, the other thing for me in a short story is I think you get a lot more leeway with leaving things unexplained. It's kind of harder
Yeah,
for
that's true for
that.
sure.
Like I've actually experimented with expanding that into a novel a couple of times because that was one story that I wrote that people kept saying, "Oh, there's more here. Like I want to see what happens to the rest of the town and all the other characters." But every time I tried to expand it, it was like a souffle, it just kind of collapsed on itself, right? It just was like, well, then things stop making sense. And there's a
Hmm.
certain, I call it the I believe button, that got to be the story has to be small enough to hit somebody's I believe button. Like, and the bigger it gets, the bigger that I believe button has to get. Until the point where I think it's unrealistic to even expect you to be able to hit somebody's I believe button. So anyway, all that is to say is that worked for that story. I think I couldn't pull that off at a novel length. I know that there are literary writers who do it.
Something that story actually reminded me of a little bit is Welcome to Night Vale. Have you ever listened to
Yeah,
Welcome to Night Vale,
yeah.
the
I get a
podcast?
lot of very favorable comparisons. I love Night Vale. I
Okay.
think that's a brilliant comparison. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm not gonna
Yeah.
argue with that.
Yeah, I think that what felt similar about it to me is that it's kind of inverted, where in Welcome to Night Vale, the space around the town gets
Mhm.
rearranged every time that someone goes there. So, nobody knows how to get there. But at the same time, even though all of this absurd stuff is happening, the stuff inside of Night Vale still has this very small town energy. I would sort of just, this reference ages like every year, but I like to describe it as sort of paranormal prairie home companion, where like
Yeah,
you,
totally.
where like the guys just recounting like all this stuff that happened in his town, but then it's actually insane, and you're just like, that's insane. And then the magic of the show is just the disconnect between those two things. But I think that also there is a sort of like liminality about both of them, where it's not just about this the town kind of takes on this weird nowhere place quality where it definitely exists, but at the same time there's something that's disconnected about it and reality. And I really like stories like that. There's one other story you probably have a much lower chance of having read, but it was called The Left Right Game. Have you heard of this story? It was like
No,
published on
no.
Reddit. Basically, the idea is that there's this investigative journalist who learns about this like urban legend where if you're in Phoenix and you just go on the city grid and you take a left and then you take a right and you take a left and you take a right and you just keep going and you do that like 40 times all the way up the city grid, then you'll go somewhere. And she's just like, no shot. That is not true. And then she does that, and then she kind of just ends up in this really weird liminal area where she's nominally driving through Arizona, but it's just kind of this weird, like, not Arizona, where she encounters increasingly strange towns that are completely disconnected from the rest of reality. That's a pretty cool story, too. I think that
Yeah.
that was sort of a story that is not as similar in vibe, but reading the premise, I'm just like, I wonder if it'll be like the left right game.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, and I think that's what is great. That's totally to my point earlier. It's like you can small towns are so evocative, right? I mean, whether you live in one or whether you're driving by one, writers are all going to take it in a really different direction for the most part. Like everybody's going to have their spin on it. All as artists, kind of working out of, whether you believe in like collective unconscious or just absorbing the materials around you some way and having that influence. None of us are like devoid of influence of other artists and other art and culture and politics. And so these things just will come into the work and we will be influenced by each other, which is a very different thing than like stealing lines out of somebody, directly copying somebody's work, which is never acceptable. But I think that we also have to acknowledge that we're social animals and we are always in conversation with other art and artists. And I think the best artists or all mediums are kind of having some sort of conversation with their own work, having their own work in conversation with the work that's going on around them, that came before them, that comes after them. And I think more than any other art, that's what we do is we work off of our predecessors and we are then working forward for the next group of people.
One strange town that I really enjoyed driving through was Gig Harbor in
Mm-hmm.
Washington. It's not terribly small, but you go there and like there's just this big harbor that just feels way bigger than any harbor should be in a town that small. I mean, it is called Gig Harbor, but you're just like, whoa, that is a
Yeah.
lot of sailboats.
Kevin,
Oh,
I'm
run
not
it back.
there.
Okay, okay. Yeah,
I'm
one of
not
my
there.
favorite um one of my favorite small towns that I've gone through is Gig Harbor in Washington, which
Mm-hmm.
is not that small, but it's pretty interesting because you get there and it's built around, not surprisingly, this giant harbor. But the harbor just feels much bigger than any harbor in a town of that size should be. And I feel like there is something fantastical about it because, like, there is that stock fantasy town where like, the main characters stay at an inn or something and they just go outside. And there's just like this giant harbor with all the boats going out to sea. And that's kind of how I felt when I ended up in Gig Harbor. I was just like, wow, there's so many sailboats in this unexpected place. It kind of felt like a little slice of in some sense, it felt like a little slice of the past. And there was also this really good ice cream shop called the Ice Creamery. Shout out Ice Creamery. But I think that's one of the only times that I've really been on my own to explore small towns because I really don't like driving and I also don't have a car. But there was just sort of this really tiny period of a month where I was not in college, not yet started work, and I just happened to have a car that is owned by my grandparents. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to drive through some towns in Washington. And so I went to Gig Harbor and I also went to Squim. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, those places are, yeah, small.
Yeah, and I use strange very affectionately. I think it's a word that kind of gets a bad rap. I think there's something really lovely about strange places and coming into some place where you get that sense when you walk in and like something is just odd about this, and not being able to even put your finger on it right away. So yeah, I mean, a lot of times it'll be an experience that I've had in a smaller town that kind of sticks with me, that makes it stand out. And then there are just places that are weird. Leavenworth is not a small town, really, but it is a
Leavenworth.
strange place. Drive around the corner, and there's this Bavarian village in the middle of the mountains of Washington State, and it has a really interesting backstory, and it's such a fun. Those little moments of surprise, I think, are the things that I'm always looking for, because that's a what if point.
This one time I met someone who was from Leavenworth. I'm like, people are from there? Like, you can be from Leavenworth? I've
Yeah.
actually been to Leavenworth a lot of times. It's probably one of the places I've been to the most times in my life, because it's pretty close to my grandparents' house, and there's not really much else to do around there. So it's like, are you guys bored? Let's go to Leavenworth again, and then we just eat our Bavarian pretzels and watch our Bavarian musical or whatever. Actually, I'm remembering this one small, strange town that I went to that was quite small and quite strange, which is this town called Coulterville. Basically, my family was taking this probably ill-advised route back from Yosemite, and our car was just really, really low on gas. And because we had to drive around these horrible switchbacks in the mountains at like 10 miles per hour. And this entire part of California was just dotted with these ghost towns, these actual ghost towns, because they were just where people were for the gold rush. And so we just ended up in this town called Coulterville that had population 154. And as a kid growing up in a pretty urban environment, I just didn't even know that was possible. I was just like, how can there only be 154 people? It's like
Yeah, I mean, yeah. And California is full of them. That's the weirdest part, is like all these little farming towns, there's little mining towns, there's like you drive through and you're like, that was a town, and it's in the rearview mirror again. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a fascination, especially for anybody who didn't grow up there. There's always the fascination of being an outsider. What is life there like for people who are in that 105 people? What is it like to grow up there?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you are one of those people, it's like the least fascinating thing in the world. But yeah, I remember my dad went to the store. I'm just like, that is the only store in this town. That makes sense. um, well, I think this is a pretty good time to wrap things up. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast. And I was wondering if there's any short story you would like to recommend or anything else that you'd like to plug.
Okay, so maybe not a short story, but I think this falls in the category graphic novels. I feel like fall in the short fiction category. So I just finished These Savage Shores. It's like really incredible telling of that combines Indian mythology, subcontinent Indian mythology, and European vampire lore with vampirism. Yeah, and it's fascinating. It's beautiful. It's terrifying. And I have read it twice before I let the library take it out of my cold fingers. It was really great.
Well, thanks so much for coming on the pod, and we will see you all next week.